In the vast Bitter Creek territory of Wyoming, November 1877, a stark contrast unfolded. While every other settler diligently fortified their homes by banking earth against cabin walls and stuffing moss between logs to ward off the encroaching winter, Nessa Harwick pursued a radically different, seemingly suicidal endeavor. Her actions prompted concerned townsfolk to ride out, convinced she was courting her own demise and that of her young daughter. This 32-year-old widow was excavating a deep pit 12 feet into the frozen earth, lining its walls with river clay and constructing what appeared to be an inverted chimney, descending rather than ascending. There was no sign of a wood stove, no iron range, no hearth. It seemed as though she were digging a grave and calling it a kitchen. One local farmer, attempting to understand her methods, suggested that no one else truly grasped Nessa's profound understanding of how the earth itself could radiate warmth from below. Nessa Harwick had arrived in Bitter Creek in the spring of 1875, a widow whose husband had succumbed to fever on the arduous journey west. Her daughter Ida, then only 5 years old, remained silent, consumed by grief. Their previous home had been in the mining camps of northern Michigan, where Nessa's father had toiled in copper shafts that burrowed hundreds of feet into the earth. She had spent her childhood in a dwelling perched directly above an abandoned mine entrance, a unique arrangement where the family slept soundly year-round, kept warm by the persistent heat rising from the old tunnels beneath their feet. In Michigan, the miners understood a fundamental truth that eluded the townsfolk. The earth possessed an inherent warmth. At a depth of 30 feet, the rock maintained a constant temperature unaffected by the seasons, warm enough to prevent water from freezing. Her father had explained this principle with simple clarity. While cold air might descend and hot air rise, this movement had its limits. The deep earth, he taught her, remained at a steady temperature, a profound warmth that had existed long before humanity walked the land. Nessa had also meticulously observed the workings of mine ventilation shafts, noting how air currents flowed predictably through the subterranean passages. She understood how a sufficiently deep pit could naturally draw in cold air from above and expel warmer air through the process of convection. Wyoming, with its promise of land and hope, delivered winters in the Bitter Creek Valley that could decimate livestock within a single night. The prevailing methods of heating, relying on immense wood consumption, terrified Nessa. Her initial 2 years were spent in a borrowed sod house, half buried in the hillside. While it leaked mud, it retained a warmth that her log cabin neighbors could only dream of. The settlers, adhering to conventional building practices, erected timber walls, stone chimneys, and employed iron stoves that devoured cordwood at an alarming rate, forcing men to labor in the timber trade year-round outside the planting season. Heat would surge up the flues, yet the floors often remained frigid. Families slept bundled in their coats, and children awoke to find frost adorning their blankets. Each spring heralded the same relentless ritual: felling trees, hauling logs, splitting firewood, and stacking it high, months of arduous labor, simply to endure the coming winter. Nessa observed this cycle with a quiet, knowing gaze. The hills surrounding Bitter Creek were sparsely dotted with abandoned prospect holes, shafts initiated by miners in search of silver or coal, only to be abandoned when the veins proved too thin. These represented readily available excavations, offering depth, free of charge, and unimpeded access to the planet's perpetual warmth. Yet every settler chose to build their homes atop the ground, rather than integrating them into it, constructing dwellings that fought against the elements when they could have harmoniously partnered with the earth below. By the year 1877, Nessa had managed to accumulate sufficient savings from her laundry work and butter sales to acquire 40 acres of land at the mouth of a narrow ravine situated to the east of town. This parcel was largely considered undesirable, its rocky soil presenting significant challenges for farming. However, for Nessa, the surface of the land held little importance. Her focus was on what lay precisely 20 feet below, where the earth harbored its ancient, unwavering warmth. Her closest neighbor, A cattle rancher named Benjamin Fletcher observed the widow and her daughter meticulously surveying the rocky incline rather than the more fertile creek bottom where any sensible person would establish a homestead. "You're looking at the hardest ground on your claim," Fletcher called out from his wagon. "A cabin needs to sit where you can get good soil and water without breaking your back." "I'm building into the hill," Nessa responded. "The cabin will be half underground. The earth will insulate the walls and provide heat from below. I need depth, not water access." Fletcher dismounted and approached, his eyes searching her face for any sign that she was jesting. "You want to bury your home like a root cellar, but to live in it like a miner's house?" he mused. "My father built over a mine shaft in Michigan. The floor stayed warm all winter from heat rising through abandoned tunnels. The earth 20 feet down holds a constant 55 degrees. That's warmer than any cabin floor in this valley come January." Fletcher slowly removed his hat. "Ma'am, I don't doubt Michigan has its methods, but this is Wyoming. The cold here gets into everything, gets into the ground, into the rock. You dig into a hillside, and you're digging into frozen earth." "The earth below the frost line doesn't freeze," Nessa stated, kneeling to sketch a rudimentary diagram in the dirt. "Frost penetrates maybe 3 feet in your worst winter. Below that, ground temperature comes from the planet's core, not the air. Dig deep enough, and you tap into warmth that's been there since creation." Fletcher studied the crude drawing. "And you'll teach this to your daughter? How to live in a hole?" Ida, who had been standing silently beside her mother, spoke for the first time. "We won't be cold." Fletcher looked down at the small girl, clad in her threadbare coat. "Your mother's plan will get you both killed. Come stay at my place until she comes to her senses." "We'll manage with what we know, Mr. Fletcher," Nessa replied. "The earth provides." A more pointed discussion ensued with Ida later, after Fletcher had ridden away. They stood at the base of the hillside, gazing up at the raw slope where their future home would be carved. "It's going to be like the sod house, isn't it?" Ida asked quietly. "The walls will smell like dirt and things will crawl in them." "It'll be better than the sod house," Nessa assured her, crouching beside her daughter. "The walls will be clay, smooth, and sealed. The floor will be warm, even when snow buries us. We'll have windows and a door that closes tight. It'll be dry and warm, and ours." "Will we still be warm when other people aren't?" Ida inquired. "Yes." "Will they say we're strange?" "They already do." Ida considered this. "Then we'll show them." News of Nessa's project spread like wildfire through the settlement within days, carried by Fletcher himself and embellished with each retelling. The widow Harwick was reportedly excavating a chamber into the hillside, constructing a tomb, and calling it a dwelling. There was no chimney, no stove, nothing that burned. They said she believed the ground would provide her warmth. At the general store, men discussed her undertaking with headshakes and dire predictions of failure. "She'll last until November," one rancher declared. "Then they'll find her frozen behind dirt walls." Another chimed in with agreement. "That girl will lose her mother to stubbornness." What Nessa Harwick instinctively understood from her childhood spent above mine tunnels, modern building science would later codify with precise terminology. However, the fundamental principles she employed had been observed for millennia, from ancient cave dwellings to root cellars designed to preserve vegetables through harsh winters. The core science was geothermal stability applied on a domestic scale. Below the frost line, soil and rock maintain a consistent temperature year-round, dictated not by surface weather conditions, but by the planet's internal heat conducting outwards. In Wyoming's latitude, this translated to approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 20 feet, irrespective of whether the surface air registered 80 degrees above or 30 degrees below zero. A conventional cabin engaged in a constant battle against winter from the exterior. Its walls, floor, and ceiling were all exposed to freezing air, allowing heat to escape through every surface faster than any stove could possibly replenish it. Conversely, a structure excavated into the earth benefited from 3 walls and a floor already existing at 55 degrees before any supplemental heating was introduced. While not luxuriously warm by comfort standards, it represented a baseline temperature that no surface cabin could ever match. The pit Nessa was planning would function through convection, the very same principle that facilitated air movement within mine shafts. Denser, colder air would naturally sink through an intake shaft, positioned at ground level. Upon reaching the pit's bottom, this air would warm through contact with the 55-degree earth. Being lighter, the warmed air would then rise through the living space and exit through a second shaft, establishing a continuous circulation devoid of any mechanical assistance. The structure would also capitalize on thermal mass, a property enabling dense materials to absorb and release heat gradually. The clay-lined walls would soak up any ambient warmth generated during the day, whether from body heat, cooking, or the weak winter sun filtering through south-facing windows. This stored energy would then radiate back throughout the night, effectively smoothing out temperature fluctuations. Nessa had dedicated 3 years to observing Wyoming winters, meticulously noting snow accumulation patterns, wind trajectories, and the shifting angles of the winter sun from October through February. She had measured the depth of frost penetration and identified which hillsides retained snow the longest. The site she ultimately selected faced south-southwest, strategically positioned to capture the maximum amount of winter sunlight during the short days when heating was most critical. The hillside itself comprised dense clay overlying bedrock, an ideal composition for excavation and thermal mass. Its natural grade facilitated drainage, and an existing rock outcrop would serve to shield the entrance from the prevailing north wind. Her design was elegantly simple. Excavate a room 16 feet square and 8 feet tall into the hillside, with the floor situated 20 feet below the natural grade. All interior surfaces were to be lined with smoothly pounded clay. Windows would be installed along the south wall. 2 vertical shafts would be constructed for air circulation. A sealed door, sleeping platforms, and storage would complete the interior. There would be no stove, no chimney, and no need for firewood, only earth, air, and physics. Construction commenced in the final week of November, beginning with the excavation, which Nessa understood would demand the majority of her physical strength. She had acquired a miner's pick and a short-handled spade, tools specifically designed for breaking through rock. Ida assisted by hauling the loosened earth in a small cart. The initial 3 feet of digging proved relatively easy, consisting of topsoil and weathered clay. Below this, the work became arduous. Dense clay, compacted over centuries and interspersed with rocks, had to be laboriously pried free. Nessa swung the pick with a steady, rhythmic cadence, breaking the packed clay into manageable chunks. They worked from dawn until their hands cramped too severely to hold their tools, then retreated to the drafty sod house to rest before returning at first light to resume their digging. By the second week of December, they had reached a depth of 12 feet, and Nessa could distinctly feel a change in the air temperature. The atmosphere at the pit's bottom was noticeably warmer than that at the surface. Frost did not form on the exposed clay overnight. She drove a stake into the floor and then meticulously measured the temperature using a mercury thermometer borrowed from the town doctor. At noon, it read 48 degrees. She checked again at midnight. 46 degrees. The earth was indeed radiating heat. Townsfolk found various pretexts to ride past their site, slowing their horses to peer into the growing excavation. Some shouted questions, their voices laced with skepticism masked as concern. "How deep you planning to go, Mrs. Harwick?" "Deep enough to reach constant earth temperature." "That's 20 feet. You'll hit groundwater before then. The water table here is 30 feet down. I checked with 3 well diggers before I bought the land. You planning to live in that hole like a badger?" "I'm planning to live warm while you split firewood in the dark." The confrontation at Fletcher's ranch occurred midway through December. Nessa had ridden into town for supplies and encountered Fletcher waiting at the mercantile, his expression grim, conveying a mixture of anger and genuine apprehension. "Mrs. Harwick," he stated, foregoing any pleasantries, "I've been patient because I respected your husband, but this has gone too far. That pit is going to collapse and bury you both, or you'll freeze to death inside it. Either way, that girl loses her mother." Nessa calmly set down the coil of rope she had been examining. Mr. Fletcher, I appreciate your concern, but the pit won't collapse. The walls are clay over bedrock, and I'm sloping them at the correct angle, and we won't freeze because the earth at that depth stays at 55 degrees year-round. I've measured it. 55 degrees? Fletcher repeated, a note of disbelief in his voice. That's not warm. That's barely above freezing. That's barely above freezing on the Fahrenheit scale, Nessa clarified. But it's 20 degrees warmer than the floor of your cabin on a January morning, and it doesn't require burning a single log to maintain. Add body heat, cooking heat, and solar gain through south windows, and the space will hold at 65 comfortably. Fletcher ran a hand through his hair, appearing agitated. You're a widow, with a child, depending on you. You're gambling both your lives on some theory from a Michigan mining camp. It's not a theory, Nessa asserted firmly. It's physics. The Earth's core is hot. That heat conducts outward. At sufficient depth, ground temperature stabilizes, regardless of surface conditions. This isn't speculation, Mr. Fletcher. It's measurable fact. Then measure it in January, Fletcher retorted, his voice hardening. Measure it when it's 30 below and the wind is howling and your daughter is shivering against clay walls in a hole. Then come tell me about your measurable facts. He departed without making any purchases. Nessa returned to her cart, where Ida sat, wrapped in a thin blanket, having overheard every word through the mercantile door. He's afraid for us, Ida said quietly. He is? Is he right to be afraid? No. How do you know? Because I've done the calculations, because my father lived over a mine tunnel for 30 years and never split firewood except for cooking, because the earth doesn't lie, Ida. Men do sometimes, out of ignorance or fear, but the earth just is what it is. The excavation reached its full depth of 20 feet. On December 28th, Nessa stood at the bottom, her boots sinking slightly into clay that felt noticeably warmer than the frozen ground above. She measured the space one final time. 16 feet square, 8 feet tall, walls sloped at 15 degrees. Perfect. Now came the finishing work, the task of transforming a mere hole into a functional home. She began with the floor, pounding it smooth with a heavy tamper, then applying a coating of clay, slip, sand, and ox blood procured from the butcher. The blood acted as a binder, creating a surface that would dry as hard as brick. She worked the mixture into the floor using a wooden float. The walls required a similar treatment. Nessa mixed clay slip with lime, creating a plaster that would seal the porous clay and provide a smooth, light-colored surface to reflect any light that entered. She worked from the bottom upwards using broad wooden trowels. Ida followed behind, smoothing the surface with a damp cloth before the plaster could set. This meticulous work took 6 days. Upon completion, the walls glowed a pale cream in the lamplight. The air shafts were the next crucial element for habitability. The cold air intake would be a vertical shaft, 4 inches square, commencing at ground level and angling downwards to meet the floor at the rear corner. Cold air would naturally descend. The warm air exhaust would rise from the front corner, ascending vertically and terminating 3 feet above ground level, capped with a rain deflector. Warm air would thus rise and exit, establishing continuous circulation. Ida held the measuring line while Nessa marked the locations, and then they assisted in excavating the narrow channels with a post hole digger. They lined each shaft with clay pipe sections ordered from PBLO, fitting them tightly and sealing the joints with lime plaster. The system remained invisible from inside the dwelling, save for 2 square openings positioned in opposite corners. Nessa tested the circulation on a frigid January morning by lighting sage in the intake shaft and observing its behavior from below. The smoke slowly descended through the shaft, lingered briefly at floor level, then gracefully rose, flowed across the ceiling towards the exhaust shaft, and disappeared upwards. The earth was indeed breathing precisely as designed. The windows were salvaged from 3 abandoned homesteads, each pane carefully removed and transported. Nessa had 9 panes in total, all roughly 2 feet square, with wooden frames that, though weathered, remained structurally sound. She installed them along the south wall in a single row, positioned at eye level, sealing each frame into openings cut through the clay. The glass, wavy and imperfect, would nonetheless admit light and whatever limited solar heat the low winter sun could provide. She chinked any gaps around each frame with oakum soaked in pine pitch. The door represented the final essential element. It was constructed from double-layered pine planks with a layer of wool, felt sandwiched between them, hung on iron hinges anchored into timber posts set deep into the clay. A heavy latch secured it from the inside, weather stripping lined all edges, and a threshold board was installed at the base. When closed, the door fit so snugly that opening it required pulling against a significant difference in air pressure. On January 15th, Nessa and Ida carried their meager possessions down into the completed dwelling: 2 straw mattresses, wool blankets, cooking pots, a small table, 2 chairs, preserved foods, lamp oil, and Ida's cherished treasures. They stacked everything against the back wall, then stood together in the center of the room, gazing around at what they had created. By early February, the Harwick dwelling had become the focal point of intense speculation in Bitter Creek. Nessa and Ida had been residing underground for 3 weeks, and not a wisp of smoke rose from any chimney on their property, primarily because no chimney existed. The external temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero on 2 separate nights. Every cabin in the valley burned wood continuously, with stoves roaring day and night. Families huddled close to heat sources, while the far corners of rooms remained stubbornly frozen. At Fletcher's ranch, they had already consumed half of their winter wood supply by early February, and Fletcher had assigned 2 men to full-time woodcutting and splitting. His children slept in their coats. His wife stuffed rags into the gaps between the logs, yet frost still formed on the nails inside the walls, and water left in a bucket overnight would freeze solid. The prevailing sentiment in town was that the widow and her daughter were either already deceased or would soon perish. Some individuals suggested sending out a party to investigate, but Fletcher argued against it. "Let her come to town when she's ready to admit defeat," he insisted. However, Nessa did not come to town, and neither did Ida. They remained in their underground home, which maintained a steady temperature that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who could comprehend their experience. The clay walls radiated the Earth's constant warmth. The air circulation system functioned flawlessly, drawing cold air down through the intake shaft, warming it upon contact with the 55-degree floor and walls, and then exhausting it through the ceiling shaft. The body heat generated by 2 people added another degree or 2 to the ambient temperature. The south-facing windows admitted weak winter sun for approximately 4 hours daily. Even this limited solar gain was sufficient to raise the interior temperature by several degrees by afternoon. Nessa had installed a mercury thermometer on the wall near the door, which she checked religiously. The morning low was 57 degrees. The afternoon high on sunny days reached 63 degrees, and at nighttime it settled at 59 degrees. The space never dropped below 55 degrees and never climbed above 65 degrees. This represented perfect thermal stability with no fuel consumption, no smoke production, and no labor required beyond the initial construction. They had built sleeping platforms against the back wall, simple timber frames with rope webbing supporting straw mattresses. These platforms rested directly against the clay walls, and the warmth radiating from the earth made the beds comfortable without any additional heating. Ida slept without her coat for the very first time since her arrival in Wyoming. Cooking was accomplished on a small, portable clay brazier that Nessa had fashioned, utilizing minimal charcoal for heat. The exhaust from the brazier rose to the ceiling and exited through the warm air shaft. They consumed perhaps 2 pounds of charcoal per day for cooking, an amount that cost virtually nothing. The contrast with the surface cabins could not have been more striking. Fletcher's family burned 30 pounds of wood daily. They were forced to wake every 2 hours to feed the stove. They spent entire days engaged in the arduous task of cutting and splitting wood. Their cabin was permeated with smoke and was never truly warm, except in the immediate vicinity of the stove. Meanwhile, 20 feet underground, Nessa and Ida lived in serene comfort. Their days were dedicated to productive activities rather than the relentless pursuit of fuel. Nessa sewed clothing, repaired tools, and meticulously planned her spring planting. Ida practiced her reading by lamplight, worked through arithmetic problems, and assisted with meal preparation. They shared stories, played simple games, and slept through the night without waking. The crisis arrived on February 23rd, commencing with a furious wind that roared down from the mountains. The temperature plummeted from 20 degrees above zero to 8 degrees below in under 6 hours. At the Miller homestead, 5 miles to the north, the smoldering chimney fire, neglected due to the sudden cold snap, finally ignited. Creosote buildup caught fire, causing a rapid flare-up that engulfed the roof timbers. The family managed to escape, but their cabin was reduced to its foundation, leaving them standing in the snow, watching everything they owned turn to ash. At Fletcher's ranch, the crisis presented itself differently, but with equal desperation. His youngest son, Peter, a 4-year-old child, had been suffering from a persistent cough for 2 weeks. The biting chill that seeped across the cabin's wooden floor had begun to lodge itself deep within his chest. Despite his best efforts to find solace near the stove, swaddled in every available textile, the young boy's health continued its downward trajectory. By the 23rd day of the month, his temperature had soared to a dangerous peak, and his breaths had become shallow gasps, each one a struggle. Fletcher's wife held him close to the hearth, a futile attempt to ward off the pervasive cold, but the child shivered uncontrollably, even with the fire roaring with all its might. The nearest physician was a grueling 2-day journey away, a trek made perilous by weather conditions that could easily claim the life of any traveler caught between settlements. That same evening, Nessa embarked on her customary weekly expedition to the settlement for essential provisions. She arrived just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, finding the small community teetering on the brink of widespread panic. The Miller family had taken refuge in the church, their temporary beds made upon the pews. Fletcher himself was at the general store, procuring spirits, as someone had optimistically suggested alcohol might help reduce his son's fever. Nessa set aside her list of needed items and approached Fletcher directly. "I've heard about your son," she began. "How severe is his condition?" "It's dire enough," Fletcher replied, his voice strained. "The fever won't break. We can't keep him warm, and getting a doctor here in this weather is impossible." "Bring him to our place," Nessa offered. "Our dwelling is warm, truly warm, not just stove warm. The boy can rest against the clay, which retains a constant heat. He'll maintain a stable temperature and breathe clean air." Fletcher regarded her with disbelief. "Your place, your hole in the ground. That's your proposed remedy?" "It is my remedy," Nessa affirmed. "The dwelling maintains a temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of external conditions. There are no drafts, no frigid floors, and no drastic temperature fluctuations. Your son is ill because he is cold, and that cold is a constant presence in your cabin. Remove the cold, and his body will have a chance to recover." "You're delusional," Fletcher declared, though his words lacked the conviction they might have held just months prior. "You're desperate, and I am offering a solution. Send someone to the claim tomorrow morning. They can witness the temperature firsthand, and then you can decide." Fletcher purchased his whiskey and rode back to his homestead without a word of commitment. However, the following morning, as the wind continued its relentless assault and his son's condition deteriorated, he dispatched his foreman up the canyon to investigate the Harwick dwelling and report his findings honestly. The foreman returned 3 hours later, his expression a mask of bewilderment. "It's warm in there," he reported. "Actually, comfortably warm. The walls are warm, the floor is warm, the air itself is warm, and there's no stove, no fire, just dirt and clay and windows." Fletcher looked at his son, still swaddled in blankets, yet trembling, his small face flushed with fever. He then glanced at his wife, whose gaze conveyed a potent mixture of fear and weary hope. "Take him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That afternoon, Fletcher made his way up the canyon, his son cradled securely against his chest. His wife followed on a second horse. They found the dwelling precisely as described, a southward-facing entrance that led down into the gentle slope of the hillside, windows capturing the weak afternoon sunlight, and no plume of smoke rising, for no chimney was present. Nessa greeted them at the entrance and gently took the boy from Fletcher's arms. She carried him down into the subterranean dwelling, laying him on a sleeping platform positioned against the far wall. Fletcher and his wife followed, stepping from the brutal, biting wind into an atmosphere that seemed to halt their every movement. The warmth was immediate and all-encompassing, not the searing intensity of a stove, but a soft, pervasive heat emanating from every surface. The clay walls radiated a comforting warmth. The floor felt warm beneath their feet. The air itself was warm, still, and refreshingly clean. Fletcher pressed his palm against the back wall, holding it there. "This is the earth," Nessa explained, kneeling beside the boy and gently touching his forehead. 20 feet of clay and rock lie beneath us, all maintaining a steady 55 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year. The walls conduct that warmth upward. The air circulation system brings in fresh air without allowing heat to escape. The windows capture solar radiation, and the thermal mass effectively smooths out any temperature fluctuations. Fletcher's wife had already shed her coat and was unwrapping the blankets from her son. The boy's shivering subsided almost instantly. His breathing, though still somewhat labored, seemed to ease as his body was no longer expending its energy fighting to maintain its core temperature. "He can rest here," Nessa assured them, adjusting the blankets. "The clay will keep him warm with minimal effort. His body can then dedicate its resources to healing rather than struggling to stay warm. You're both welcome to stay for as long as you need." Fletcher surveyed his surroundings with eyes that finally perceived the truth of Nessa's explanation, a truth she had shared months earlier. The thermometer on the wall read 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Through the windows, the relentless wind raged, yet inside, his son was comfortably warm. His wife had removed her coat, and the ambient air was so pleasant that Fletcher found himself beginning to sweat within his heavy woolen layers. "How is this possible?" he marveled. "You have no fire, no stove, no chimney." "The earth is the source," Nessa replied simply. "It has always been the source. I have merely constructed a dwelling that allows us to access what the earth provides freely." "You could have built this," Fletcher stated, a stunned realization dawning in his voice. "Anyone could have. Anyone with land and a suitable hillside could have achieved exactly this, instead of spending all summer cutting timber only to burn it throughout the winter." "Yes," Nessa agreed. "And I told you. I tried to explain, and you accused me of being insane. You were not yet ready to comprehend." Peter Fletcher remained within the Harwick dwelling for a full 8 days. His fever broke on the 3rd day, his cough began to loosen on the 5th, and by the 8th he was alert enough to sit up and ask for food. The consistent, stable warmth had allowed his body to effectively combat the illness without the added stress of fluctuating temperatures. Fletcher's wife stayed with him for the entire duration, sleeping on a second platform and preparing meals on Nessa's brayer. Fletcher returned to his ranch to attend to the livestock, but made the journey back up the canyon daily. With each visit, the disparity between his previous way of life and the newfound possibilities grew more evident. On the 8th day, as Peter had recovered sufficiently to travel, Fletcher spoke with a profound sense of humility. "I have resided here for 14 years, he confessed. "I have erected 3 cabins, consumed enough wood to clear 10 acres of land, and endured freezing temperatures through every single winter. You have demonstrated that all of that was entirely unnecessary, that the warmth I required was buried 20 feet beneath my boots. You were unaware. No one had shown you. Now you possess the knowledge. I wish to construct one on my property. Will you instruct me? I will teach anyone who seeks my guidance." The first new construction commenced at Fletcher's ranch in early March. Nessa oversaw the process, imparting her foundational principles to Fletcher and his crew. They selected a hillside with a southern exposure, meticulously measured the necessary depth to achieve constant earth temperatures, and began excavating a chamber measuring 16 feet square. The Miller family, who were still temporarily housed at the church, were the second to commit to building. Nessa accompanied them, surveying their fire-ravaged property and identifying a suitable slope for their dwelling. A farmer named Jacob Reinhardt, who had resorted to burning his furniture throughout the winter to supplement his dwindling wood supply, was the third to join the initiative. By April, 5 families were actively engaged in excavating earth-sheltered dwellings under Nessa's expert supervision. She diligently traveled between the various sites, verifying excavation depths, demonstrating clay plastering techniques, and explaining the crucial principles of air circulation. A young assistant accompanied her, carrying tools and diligently recording all relevant information. The construction efforts continued throughout the spring and into the summer months. Each family thoughtfully adapted the fundamental design to suit their specific location and needs. Fletcher, with his family of 5, opted for a larger structure. The Millers incorporated a separate root cellar. Reinhardt, while adding extra windows, adhered to the core principles of deep excavation, clay-sealed walls for thermal mass, dedicated air circulation shafts, south-facing windows, and precisely sealed doors. The community that had once openly mocked Nessa's unconventional project observed these structures taking shape throughout the summer, their initial derision gradually transforming into curiosity, then genuine interest, and ultimately decisive action. By August, 11 families were actively engaged in building their own earth-sheltered residences. The town's blacksmith began fabricating specialized excavation tools, and the general store started stocking essential materials like clay pipe and lime plaster. A cooper even produced weather-tight doors, meticulously crafted to Nessa's exact specifications. This transformative technology spread not through forceful persuasion, but through the undeniable power of observation and the pressing weight of necessity. Men who had endured the bone-chilling cold of a Wyoming winter were hardly eager to repeat such an experience. Women who had witnessed their children shivering despite the efforts of roaring fires yearned for the consistent warmth provided by Nessa's dwelling. Furthermore, the labor investment, while significant, was considerably less demanding than the perpetual cycle of timber felling required for conventional heating methods. By September, the entire valley had undergone a remarkable metamorphosis. Earth-sheltered dwellings now dotted the hillsides across the region, their southward-facing windows capturing the increasingly low-lying sun, their interiors maintaining comfortable temperatures without consuming a single log for fuel. Families who had successfully completed their constructions moved into their new homes before the arrival of the first frost. Fletcher's dwelling was among the first to be finished, completed in late August. His family spent the month of September experiencing firsthand what Nessa had endeavored to explain many months prior: consistent temperatures irrespective of external conditions, no consumption of firewood, no smoky interiors, and no abrupt awakenings in the dead of night. Only the gentle, constant warmth of the earth radiating upward through their clay walls. His eldest son, who had spent the previous winter tirelessly splitting wood until his hands bled, questioned why they had delayed such an obvious solution for so long. Fletcher found himself without a satisfactory answer, attributing it to a combination of pride and ignorance. The Miller family moved into their newly constructed dwelling in September. Mrs. Miller stood in the center of the warm, clay-lined room and quietly wept. Their previous home had been destroyed by fire. This one, built with the earth's embrace, would never succumb to flames. It would never freeze. It was destined to stand for generations, requiring neither constant repair nor fuel. The earth itself would provide warmth for her family for as long as the earth endured. By the close of October, 19 families residing in the Bitter Creek Valley were inhabiting earth-sheltered dwellings, and not a single one had felled a tree for heating purposes. The remaining families, those still occupying traditional cabins, commenced their annual ritual of woodcutting, with a growing awareness that they were consciously choosing the more arduous path. Some were driven by stubbornness, others by a fear of the unknown, and some because their land lacked suitable slopes, but all observed the families living in earth-sheltered homes with a palpable mixture of envy and regret. Nessa Harwick resided for an additional 38 years in the dwelling she had meticulously carved into the Wyoming hillside, never once burning a log for heat nor experiencing a midnight awakening to replenish a fire. Her daughter, Ida, grew up sleeping in consistent warmth, studying by lamplight in stable temperatures, and learning that the earth held solutions if one only knew how to seek them. She married a surveyor's son in 1895 and subsequently constructed her own earth-sheltered home on adjacent land, 20 meters to the east, diligently teaching her husband the very principles her mother had instilled in her. The dwelling that the townspeople had once disparagingly referred to as a tomb remained structurally sound for 87 years without requiring significant repairs. The clay walls maintained their finish, the air shafts continued to function as designed, and the windows admitted light throughout decades of harsh Wyoming winters. In 1964, a graduate student, while researching frontier construction methods, located the site and recorded interior temperatures that closely matched NASA's measurements, with a deviation of less than 3 degrees. The fundamental principle that NASA later recognized, that the planet itself serves as a vast thermal reservoir accessible to anyone willing to excavate sufficiently deep, is now evident in modern geothermal heating systems, earth-sheltered architecture, and passive house designs. While the terminology has evolved, the underlying physics remain unchanged. What NASA intuitively understood, and what miners had recognized for centuries, was that battling winter with fire represented a choice of exhausting labor when the earth inherently offered unwavering constancy. Her neighbors tirelessly chopped wood, burned it, and endured the cold. Nessa, conversely, excavated, sealed her dwelling, and slept in perpetual warmth. Benjamin Fletcher never reverted to relying solely on his wood stove. He maintained his earth-sheltered dwelling for the remainder of his life, and his son, upon establishing his own homestead, constructed a similar structure. Peter Fletcher, the young boy whose critical illness had prompted his father's arduous journey up that canyon in February, grew to adulthood in robust health, benefiting from the stable warmth that Nessa's profound knowledge had provided. The winter of 1879 remained the definitive benchmark against which all subsequent winters in Bitter Creek were measured. However, it was not the severity of the cold that people remembered most vividly, but rather the stark contrast. Families were freezing in their conventional cabins, while the Harwick dwelling maintained its comfortable warmth without a fire. Children coughed from the frigid air, while Peter Fletcher recuperated in a climate of stable heat. Men labored by splitting wood in the dim light, while Nessa and Ida slept soundly through the night. The fundamental difference was not one of wealth or sheer luck, but rather of acquired knowledge and the courage to trust in the immutable laws of physics over deeply ingrained tradition. 20 years after that pivotal winter, a traveling journalist journeyed through Bitter Creek and documented the burgeoning presence of earth-sheltered dwellings dotting the surrounding hillsides. The resulting article was subsequently published in several prominent Western newspapers. Nessa, by then 54 years old and a grandmother of 3, was interviewed at her unique dwelling. The journalist inquired whether she felt proud of having fundamentally altered the architectural landscape of the valley. "Proud isn't precisely the correct term," Nessa responded thoughtfully. "The earth has always possessed an inherent warmth. I simply demonstrated to people how to access it." Following Nessa's passing in 1915, Ida discovered a handwritten note tucked within her mother's Bible. It read, "I told them the earth would keep us warm. They claimed I was digging our grave. Yet, the earth provided warmth for 38 winters without the necessity of a single fire. The ranchers consumed their forests. We consumed nothing. I grasped a fundamental truth that they adamantly refused to learn. The warmth was perpetually present 20 feet below the surface, patiently awaiting discovery. The dwelling itself remained structurally sound and habitable until 1965, when the entrance ultimately succumbed to erosion and collapsed. However, the chamber carved into that hillside consistently maintained a temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit through every season, enduring droughts, blizzards, and the relentless march of changing decades, serving as undeniable proof that Nessa Harwick had possessed a profound understanding of fundamental survival principles.